During a severe flood, a mother and her young son were trapped inside their car as the water rose at a frightening rate. Alone, without help, and with no way out, she felt despair take over. But something happened there, something that no one can explain to this day. What she experienced at that moment changed everything. On May 25, 2024, it was supposed to be just another late afternoon, a Saturday like any other, one of those where routine swallows up the perception of danger. The sky had been pouring its fury for hours, but in that region, rain was almost a sight to behold. Living in a small town is like that. We learned to ignore the signs because it had always worked before. The idea was simple. Pick up the son, go back home and take shelter until the storm passed. No detours, no surprises. At least that's what it seemed like. The route was familiar to everyone. Every traffic light, every store, every pothole in the asphalt was already part of the landscape decorated by every day. Life, he didn't even need to think. His fingers turned the steering wheel almost on autopilot. Outside, the puddles turned into opaque mirrors, reflecting the darkening sky and the flickering streetlights. The water ran furiously down the gutters, swallowing dry leaves and pieces of trash that swirled around, as if they were spinning in the drain of an invisible world. But nothing seemed too unusual. After all, it only took 3 streets, just 3, to get home. The daycare was still open, but the playground was already deserted. Some mothers had run out as soon as the first thunderclaps rumbled. The teacher smiled with the tired look of someone who knew that the day would not end anytime soon. And there was my little boy Pietro, who ran, as he always did, with his coat half open, his hair wet and his eyes shining. He was carefully placed in the car seat, the belt tight, and a kiss on the forehead. He was safe, at least inside. He seemed safe. Inside the car, the air was humid. The ED soundtrack was the sound of rain hitting the windshield wipers, the muffled roar of the engine, and the calm voice of the radio announcer, who seriously read a warning bulletin. It is not advisable to travel in risk areas. There have been flooding incidents in the last few hours. The phrase lingered in the air, but it was not enough to generate action. Maybe because of self-confidence, maybe because of fatigue, or maybe because when you are so close to home, your body insists on believing that the worst will never happen to you. He turned onto the first street carefully. The asphalt was already showing signs of saturation. A truck was moving slowly, raising side waves that hit the tires as if challenging the small cars around it. Wet leaves stuck to the glass. The light from the streetlights, now on, was distorted by the reflection of the puddles that accumulated on every corner. The windshield wiper seemed to be fighting against the force of nature, and time, somehow, seemed to slow down. On the second street, a larger puddle forced the car to slow down. The headlights illuminated the path, but what was visible was a mixture of mist, steam, and water. Every meter seemed thicker. Still, the thought repeated like a mantra. Not long to go. Only 3 streets to go, just 1 more minute. Another 60 seconds, and they would be safe. But all it took was turning that corner to realize that I had entered the wrong place, at the wrong time. It didn't take much. There was no clear warning, no siren, no one shouting danger, just the feeling that the world had changed in a single second. It was the same old street, but it seemed unrecognizable, as if it had become a silent trap. What the eyes saw was water. Water that shouldn't be there. Too much water rising up the sidewalks, covering the drains, slowly swallowing the car tires. Everything seemed to have lost its shape, and even so, there was no going back. There, on that curve that I had already made dozens of times, something broke inside. It wasn't just fear. It was the certainty that from then on nothing would be the same. When something truly touches the heart, we can't go back to the way things were before. And since this story spoke to you in some way, now is the right time. Subscribe to the channel and activate the bell, because what's coming will stir your soul even more. The car slid as if the ground had disappeared beneath the tires. There was no impact, no crash noise, just the strange sensation of losing control without knowing why. Like when your hand lets go of a door handle, expecting it to be steady and finds nothing. The vehicle, which had been steady until then, began to move slowly, not forward, but sideways, as if it were being pushed by an invisible force. The steering wheel became too light, as if it were no longer connected to anything. The asphalt had disappeared, and with it, the illusion of safety. The water rose at a frightening speed. It wasn't just rain. It was as if the ground was giving back everything it could no longer bear. In a few seconds, it was covering the tires. It was rising up the sides, sticking leaves, bags, and mud against the bodywork. Outside, shop windows began to go dark. Doors slammed shut. Lights disappeared behind the fogged glass, as if the world were hiding. Inside, the silence was broken only by the deep sound of the water lapping under the car, a muffled, constant, almost hypnotic sound. In the rearview mirror, 2 eyes wide, open, no tears, no screams, just the look of someone who trusted without understanding. The car seat still held the small body firmly, but fear was already taking up residence in that silence. Children perceive more than adults admit. They don't need an explanation when the environment changes. They feel it, and at that moment everything was already too different. Reverse was pressed instinctively. Once, twice, 3 times. No response. The gear lever shook in my hand, but the car didn't react. Not even a jolt. The gear wouldn't engage. It was like being inside a sleeping body trying to scream with muscles that no longer obeyed. The dashboard flashed red lights that seemed to mock the impotence. The pedals sank like butter. Nothing had any effect. Not the brake, not the steering wheel, nothing. That was when the front of the car began to sink, slowly but steadily, as if it had been pulled by chains attached to the end of the street. The water now covered half of the wheels, licking. The doors insistently. The vehicle sank, but the movement was subtle, almost respectful, like a predator that doesn't need to run because it already knows its prey is surrounded. My heart, which had been racing, now beat like an out-of-step drum. It was impossible to tell if it was more fear or disbelief. His hands shook as he turned the steering wheel harder. Nothing. The windows began to fog up, and the air inside the car seemed thicker. Each breath required more effort. The windshield wipers, overcome by the rain, stopped intermittently, leaving streaks that blurred his vision even more. Outside, everything was grey. Inside, time seemed frozen. A minute turned into an eternity filled with doubts that screamed without sound. The headlights, still on, reflected against the water in the street, but now they seemed to be illuminating a murky river rather than an avenue. Cars ahead were already partially submerged. Some had their doors open, abandoned in a hurry. On one of the sidewalks, a fallen bicycle floated, spinning on itself as if lost in time. The scene looked like a scene from a disaster movie, but the smell wasn't Hollywood. It was real. It smelled of mud, of rust, of terror. Desperate attempts began, banging on the door with his fist, forcing the doorknob, screaming for help even though no one was in sight. Every second counted, but there was no clock to help measure it. It was as if time was now divided between before the corner and after it. Idaba. Cell phone lying on the passenger seat was vibrating. Some kind of notification, maybe from a social network, maybe from the family group. A cruel irony. While inside the car the fight for survival was going on, the world kept sending emojis and stickers. It was impossible to get it now. The seat was already starting to get wet. The water was rising faster inside than anyone could have imagined, and there was no way it would stop. Outside, there were no sirens, no voices, no footsteps. It was as if the entire city had disappeared. Cars passed by far away, too fast to notice what was happening on that corner. Anyone looking from afar might not even notice that there were people inside. The water, now dirty and heavy, reached halfway between the doors, and with it, the cold. A kind of cold that doesn't just come from the temperature. It comes from fear, from the feeling that maybe no one will make it in time, that maybe that moment, that car, that trembling body is the last portrait of someone's story. And even trying to keep his head up, his instinct was already starting to prepare for the worst. Curiously, what echoed most in my mind was not the pain, it was the memory of normal mornings, of peaceful Sundays, of times when everything seemed under control. The thought kept repeating, why did I turn there? But there was no more room for guilt, only for action, or attempted action, because nothing, absolutely nothing, responded anymore. And it was at that moment, exactly at that point between panic and surrender, that his eyes closed for a second, maybe out of exhaustion, maybe out of faith, maybe out of fear of looking at his own son and seeing in his eyes the reflection of the end. Time stopped, or it seemed to have stopped, but the worst was yet to come. The sound of despair knocks on the door. and everything seems to be happening for the last time. Have you ever experienced a moment like this? When the air became heavy, time stopped and it seemed like there was no way out. Yes or no? Tell us about your experience in the comments so that we can strengthen each other's faith. The water was already up to his chest. His entire body was starting to lose its sense of balance, as if every movement had to be relearned. The volume of the liquid rose without asking permission, occupying every space as if it owned it. The leather of the bench creaked softly, as if complaining about the weight of the flood invading its structure. Inside, time seemed suspended, not by peace, but by the imminence of something irreversible. In the car seat, the boy didn't scream. He just cried softly, as if he knew that raising his voice wouldn't help. The crying was dry, hoarse, with pauses that were too long between one breath and the next. His eyes were wide open, his skin stuck together with sweat and water, his body still restrained by the belts. That restraint was unbearable to watch. The buckle was released with his hands shaking, his fingers failing as if he were handling hot iron. But the click finally came, like a small victory in the middle of a battlefield. Holding the boy in her arms seemed to bring some sense of protection, but it soon became clear that there was nowhere to protect him. There was no dry place, no safe roof, no time. The space around her was shrinking. The volume of water made the seat give way. The floor was no longer the floor. Gravity seemed to have gone mad, and the body floated in small, uncontrollable impulses. She tried to open the door once, twice, 5 times. The pull was strong, desperate, but on the other side there was something even stronger, a force that did not want to give in. His shoulder was used as a battering ram in a sharp blow. The car shook. Nothing gave way. Not a slap. Only his own breathing echoing muffledly against the glass. And his heart, now too fast, beating like a hammer, trying to break open an invisible wall. It was like being inside a sealed aquarium, but where the fish could no longer swim, only stay alive for a few more seconds. The windows showed shadows dancing outside. Blurred lights passed in the distance, cars or street lights perhaps. Nothing steady, nothing reliable, not a living soul around. The water outside the car was murky, heavy, full of floating debris, papers, leaves, something that looked like a bag wrapped around a branch. The world outside was already another world, distant, untouchable, closed to help. The pressure of the water against the doors would later explain why they wouldn't open from the inside in situations like this. But at that moment, nothing was rational. The body wanted to get out. It wanted to breathe. It wanted to live. The brain insisted on looking for exits that didn't exist. Meanwhile, the air gap was shrinking inch by inch. The sound from the dashboard disappeared. The radio hissed and died. The windshield wipers stopped with a squeak. And suddenly, everything went silent. There was no way to tell the time. There was no cell phone signal. The car was now a floating capsule adrift in an urban ocean, a place where time doubled and thoughts sped up. Random scenes came to mind. Breakfast that morning, her son's sock with a rocket design on it, the hurried kiss she didn't have time to give him on the cheek before leaving. Small scenes that suddenly seemed too big to forget. The mind screamed, only him, save him. That was all that mattered now, even if the world ended right there, right then. The only thing that made sense was that the child would come out alive. The body, even exhausted, found invisible reserves of strength. Muscles ached. Arms were already shaking from supporting so much weight and tension. But they still held on tight. They still tried. They still fought. And it was at that moment, with the water already touching the line of the neck, that the air changed. Not by temperature, by texture. What had previously been difficult to breathe now seemed to be made of cloth, thick, too hot. The lungs pulled hard but received almost nothing. Each second without air was a separate count. The ceiling was close, too close. The sound of one's own heart became deafening. Still, there was no scream, just the child's fixed gaze, and the silent decision of one who knew he would do everything possible, until the end, even though the end was just seconds away. When the end seemed imminent, the prayer was just one: save him, save my boy. If this part touched your heart, comment here, save the one I love. Because there are times when a mother's love exceeds any other desire, and the most absolute desire is to save her son, even if she herself does not survive. The water covered everything. The sound of the world, which until seconds before had still existed in muffled noises, disappeared completely. Now, All that remained was the silence that hurts, the wet, heavy silence that invades the ear from the inside and makes the body itself a strange place. The air bubbles rose slowly, like small broken promises, bursting against the ceiling without mercy. What had been despair had become suspension. The chaos had stopped, not because everything had been resolved, but because there was nothing more to do. His lungs burned as if he had swallowed fire. His throat contracted reflexively, trying to hold on to what could no longer be held. His mind was beginning to lose its grip on reality, and his reasoning, although still active, no longer obeyed. Logic. Thoughts became confused. His senses failed him. The pressure of the water crushed his ears and ribs. It was as if his body was slowly being removed from life and returned to the invisible. In her arms, the little one remained, no longer agitated, no longer crying, just glued to her, encased in a hug that, until the last second, said, "I'm with you." There was no panic in his eyes, but something even harder to face. Trust. That fragile calm of someone who believes that everything will be okay, even when everything says it won't. And that's exactly what cuts the deepest. Darkness came before the eyes closed, because the darkness there was not the absence of light, it was the absence of meaning. No direction made sense. The ceiling and the floor were already one. The notion of up or down had been lost in the internal whirlwind that lack of air causes. The brain, without oxygen, began to do what it usually does in extreme moments, look for a way out from within. Curiously, the image of death did not come to mind. What came to mind was the memory of childhood, the memory of the old mattress at Grandma's house, the radio playing hymns on Sundays, the memory of the mother kneeling beside the bed. "The Lord is my shepherd." The beginning of Psalm 23 came to mind with a clarity that defied the moment, but neither mouth nor throat nor air, no part of the body was capable of transforming that verse into voice. Trying to pray without breathing is an act as desperate as it is beautiful, because even without sound, the soul speaks. And in that moment, even with my eyes closed and the pain spreading through my extremities, there was a silent prayer happening, not asking for life, not asking for salvation, just saying in a silent cry, "Not with him, please, not with him." Consciousness began to waver. Images began to flash through my mind, as if someone were playing an old tape at high speed. The day he was born, the smell of warm milk on the blanket, his laughter as he took his first shower with the hose. Scenes that came uncontrollably, as if my spirit itself were trying to hold on to what was about to escape, and even without any more strength, something inside refused to let that be the end. Research on drowning reports that in the final moments, many people describe feelings of calm, a false peace caused by the release of endorphins in the face of collapse. But anyone who has actually been there knows that before the calm comes, an internal scream, lament that no one hears, a goodbye that no one sees. And that was exactly what happened there, not a peaceful end, but a moment that screamed inside, "Not yet." Each second was eternal. The body, submerged, no longer reacted. The muscles no longer responded to commands. Everything hurt, even the things that shouldn't hurt. But at the same time, the pain seemed to be going away, as if it were no longer the owner of the body. A strange lightness was beginning to set in. And this lightness is what was most frightening, because whoever feels lightness in the midst of despair is on the verge of letting go of the rope. The tight embrace was beginning to weaken. The arms no longer held tightly, but they were still there. They still protected. They still stood between danger and what one loved. The mind, even clouded, understood. There was nothing more that could be done. And then, for the first time since it all began, the fighting stopped. Closing my eyes was involuntary. My heartbeat slowed. The sound of my heart began to fade, not for lack of noise, but because my entire body seemed to be shutting down. The world, which had been deafening before, was now completely silent. A silence of surrender, a silence of the end. There was no more ground, no ceiling, no time. There was only one certainty that inside still echoed like the last thread of prayer. If you have to take someone, take me, but leave my boy behind. When the strength is gone, the soul continues to pray in silence. And sometimes the most sincere prayer is, "Take me, but save the one I love." If this moment touched you, write here in the comments. I still have someone for whom I pray like this. Let's transform this section into a place of living faith and real sharing. But then, Something touched his shoulder. It wasn't water. It wasn't body movement. It wasn't a sensation created by the mind. It was different, a firm but serene touch, like someone who touches someone with reverence, who is about to let go of their last hope. It was subtle enough not to scare us, but too present to be ignored. At that very moment, something inside lit up, a feeling that you don't feel when you're in panic, a peace that prevails over fear, as if saying without words, "Not yet." There is no wind in the water, there is no air to move the current, nothing moves lightly, but that touch seemed like a breath, a gesture that came from where there was no logic, a movement contrary to the physics of that space. No turbulence, no drag, just softness, a breeze where everything was heavy. And it was this lightness that made the heart, until then almost motionless, beat again, not in despair, but in recognition. Little by little, the body began to feel something that did not come from the senses, a presence, a force that did not push, that did not demand, that did not pull violently, but that invited, as if to say, "If you want to live, follow me." It was something that took up space and, at the same time, soothed the soul. That feeling of being completely alone had disappeared, and the fear which had previously occupied everything now retreated, as if it knew it could no longer remain there. The movement began effortlessly. The weight of the body no longer weighed. It was as if something was supporting it without needing to explain how. There was no longer any direction, but there was guidance. Consciousness was still fragile, the eyes half dark, but there was no more pain. There was no panic. It was like waking up slowly from a bad dream, while a firm hand, but made of light, showed that the night had not won. When his eyes finally focused, the vision became clear. It was no ordinary hand. It was not human. The light did not come from outside. It was the hand itself. It glowed like fire but did not burn. It had shape but no shadow. A living light, vibrant, warm without being abrasive, familiar without being unfamiliar. A presence that is recognized in the spirit. Even if the body has never seen anything like it, that light did not illuminate like a flashlight. It did not reflect the chaos around it. It pushed the chaos away. Wherever that presence touched, the water seemed to give way. There were no bubbles. There was no current. The environment, previously in collapse, now seemed at rest, as if time itself had stopped to respect what was happening there. There was no need to ask who it was. There was no need to speak. There was no need to understand. The soul recognizes the touch of the eternal, and in that moment all that existed was the shining hand and the urge to follow it. It was as if it said, "You will not die here." Not yet. The boy was still in her arms, and for some reason he seemed calm too. There was no more crying. There was no stiffness. There was stillness, as if the same one who had touched her shoulder had also touched that small body and said, "You are in my care too." And that was enough. No more questions were needed. Faith prevailed over fear, and when that happens, even the impossible begins to obey. Many testimonies around the world speak of similar apparitions, figures of light that appear in the final moments. Rescuers report people being pulled from wreckage by invisible hands. Survivors describe warmth coming from cold places and gentle touches in environments where there was only death. Some call it a hallucination, others call it a coincidence, but those who live it know, and those who feel it never forget. The hand guided not the arm but the soul. There was no effort, there was no resistance. The body moved as if in a reverse river, towards life, towards the surface, towards something that human eyes could not yet see, but the spirit had known for a long time. And all anyone could think there in that second was, it was him, it was he who came. There are times when everything seems to be over, until something taps you on the shoulder and says, "Not yet." If you've ever experienced something that you can't explain but you know it was God, comment below, "He's the one who came." Your story could rekindle someone's faith today. The next second was a blur, a gap between death and life that could never be explained in human words. What came next was not exactly waking up, but existing again. The water no longer pressed against his chest. The darkness had receded, and the air, previously absent, now rushed in again, violently, urgently, burning his throat like fire, but proving that there was still time. The sound of rain hitting the concrete was the first thing to be heard, and soon after, the crying itself. But it wasn't a cry of fear. It was the cry of someone who had returned. The body was still shaking. The reasoning wasn't keeping up. and everything around seemed to be in slow motion. A cold, wet sidewalk, a puddle next to the hand, the texture of the asphalt sticking to the skin. Each sensation was rediscovered as if for the first time. Coughing was an instinct, as if the body wanted to rid itself of the memory of the water. The sound came hoarse, broken, but present. The chest rose and fell quickly. Each breath was almost a sob. There was something strange in the air, a smell of earth, of rain, of clay. But it was more than that. It smelled of deliverance, the smell of a miracle. And once you smell that smell, you never forget it. They were lying on the sidewalk, soaking wet, their clothes stuck to their bodies, their hair stuck to their faces. The boy next to them was coughing too, but he was breathing. He was awake. He looked around as if he didn't know exactly where he was, but he was there, seeing, feeling, alive. And that alone was enough to transform that cold floor into the most sacred scene the world could ever witness. Around, no cars, no tires, no doors slamming, no headlights, no horns, not a soul around. Just the sound of rain, distant thunder, and the silent certainty that something out of the ordinary had just happened. And the most curious thing, there were no marks, no drag, no sign that anyone had been around. It was as if they had been placed there, carefully, with purpose, by hands that leave no traces. The body was still trying to understand. Every muscle seemed to be waking up from a blackout. But inside, there was no longer fear. There was reverence. The sensation was similar to waking up from a nightmare, but with the clarity that it was not a dream. Everything was real. The drowning, the touch, the light, the hand, the peace, and now, life. It was still there. It still pulsed, and none of it had a rational explanation. His head turned from side to side. He tried to find someone, a rescuer, a driver, an open door, a face, but nothing, no one, not even a sign that someone might have fled too quickly. Everything was empty, and yet everything was loaded, as if the environment was still permeated by the presence of something that cannot be seen with the eyes, but that the spirit recognizes. Interestingly, the sidewalk where they were was not an easy place to reach. Staying there meant having been pulled out of the current, crossed a dangerous stretch, overcome an obstacle. Neither of them would have had the strength to do it. Not with ordinary help, not with technique, not with trying. The position in which they were found was not natural. It was divine. There are similar testimonies recorded all over the world. People who survived falls from great heights and were found in places that defy logic. Children who disappeared for hours and were later found in inaccessible places. People who climbed out of wreckage alone, but with memories of hands that pulled them, voices that called out, lights that shone. In all of them, the same phrase emerges: "I know I didn't get out of there alone." That was also the only certainty at that moment. No matter the confusion, the numbness, the disbelief, there was no visible explanation, but there was conviction. That was no ordinary survival. That was not physical strength, it was not luck, it was not chance, it was intervention. It was a touch from above, it was presence, it was a miracle. And when the heart understands that, it is never the same again. There are deliverances that the eyes cannot explain, but the heart recognizes them immediately. If this spoke to you, comment, #I'm not alone, because sometimes what seems like coincidence is just God acting in silence. When the firefighters finally arrived, the sky was still pouring down its fury, but it was already as if it were tired. The rain, once fierce, was now just trickling. The scene was one of post-war silence. Sirens were off, boots were treading water, flashlights were sweeping the deserted streets. Their first reaction was one of shock. A car was completely submerged, doors closed, windows intact, but just a few meters away, two bodies were lying on the sidewalk, alive, conscious, breathing. The approach was cautious. The face of someone who has seen a lot of things and almost always finds the worst. But what they found there on that corner, forgotten by the city, was different, not only because of the state of the bodies, but because of the silence that surrounded them. There were no screams, no calls for help, no movement, only the presence of something inexplicable hovering over everything, like a cloud that cannot be seen with the eyes, but can be felt on the skin. Protocol required questions. "Who pulled you out of the car?" one of them asked. It was a legitimate question. Logic dictated asking it. The rescue seemed obvious. Someone would have jumped in, broken the window, pulled them out, but there was no broken glass, no signs of forced entry, no cuts, no bloodstains, and strangest of all, no signs of anything around, no footprints, no dragging, no life jackets, no ropes, nothing. One of them spun around the car. The light from the flashlight cut through the muddy water and illuminated the interior. Empty child seat, sunken seats, the windshield wiper still leaning in the middle of the glass, like a last futile attempt to resist. But nothing there explained how the occupants had gotten out. The depth of the water, the pressure on the doors, the force needed to open any exit. Nothing added up. None of the hypotheses made sense. "How did you get out?" they repeated. The question came again, this time softer, as if they no longer expected a logical answer, but still needed to hear something. His eyes were full, his breathing was ragged, his body was still damp, stuck to the sidewalk. But his soul, I already knew that. There was no need to construct an explanation. There was no elaborate speech, just the truth that burned in his chest and came along with the tears. It was him. It wasn't just a loose phrase, it was a declaration. It was certainty. His still trembling voice carried more faith than many long sermons. And when he said, "My mother's God, the angel she said, existed," was him. It wasn't a question of religious inheritance. It was a lived testimony. It was a real encounter. The memories of childhood came flooding back. The simple services, the prayers before bed, the stories that seemed so far from reality until that day. You always hear that God sends angels, but until you experience the moment when no one else could help, and even then something happened, that remains just a phrase. Once you experience it, it becomes a conviction. One of the firefighters tried to hide his shock, but his expression could not hide his uneasiness. People trained to provide assistance, to deal with tragedy, to keep reason above emotion. Suddenly, they found themselves facing something that challenged everything they knew. And this feeling is often the beginning of a new faith. Stories like this are rarely recorded as they should be. In official reports, it might be written, "Victims rescued outside the vehicle, causes not identified." But the truth does not fit into reports, nor into statistics, nor into protocol. The truth lives in the invisible, in what cannot be photographed, in what can only be felt. And at that moment, everyone there felt it. There was no need to prove anything else. The miracle did not need to be defended. It was alive, it was breathing, it was coughing at his side. It was in the child's eyes, in the warmth of his embrace, in the silence that spoke louder than any siren, and in the certainty that it was not the work of man. It could not have been. There are deliverances that logic cannot explain, but the soul recognizes. If you also believe that he was the one who saved me, write with faith and leave a heart in the comments, and allow your testimony to strengthen someone today. The hand that saved left no visible marks, no footprints on the ground, no sign of passage, no presence recorded by cameras, no name written down in medical records, but it left something much deeper, something that neither time nor oblivion, nor even the doubts of the world can erase. Faith, not that fragile faith which only appears in beautiful words, but a faith that burns because it has seen, it has touched, it has been touched. Since that day, absolutely everything has changed inside. The routine continued. The clock didn't stop, the world didn't slow down, but nothing is the same as before. The way we look at life, the way we perceive silence, the way we feel time, everything now carries a presence that was once theory. Doubt has become a distant memory. What was once repeated by tradition is now experience. Now it is truth tattooed on the soul. Faith, which was once a childhood memory, was rekindled like a new flame. A faith that no longer needs arguments, because it has already been tested. A faith that has seen the impossible happen, that knows the sound of a miracle, that recognizes the atmosphere when heaven invades earth. A faith that no longer needs signs, because it was saved by one. There is no name for that hand, no record of heavenly origin, no angelic uniform that would allow us to say who it was. There is only the certainty that it was there, and that it was present in a way that no science could reproduce. That light that enveloped, that touch that pulled, that peace that interrupted death, everything was real. And what remained is even more real. Pietro is still here. He runs around the house. He plays with simple things. He is afraid of thunder, but he smiles when he sees the light coming through the window. He doesn't know everything that happened, and maybe he doesn't need to know now, but he carries something in his eyes that cannot be explained. A different glow, as if you had seen something that you cannot say, as if you had also been touched and knew. The perception of the invisible has become sharper since then. People pass by on the street and carry pain that can only be seen in their eyes. Everyday situations take on new meanings. An umbrella forgotten in the back seat, a dry shoe when it should be soaked, a child smiling in the middle of the confusion. Everything has become a sign, because after experiencing a miracle, the heart learns to pay more attention. Interestingly, many who hear this type of story still look for a logical explanation. They try to find the loophole, the error, the coincidence, but those who have experienced it do not need to prove it. The experience imposes itself. It is in the body, it is in the gesture, it is in the way one says God's name after being saved by Him. It is in the silence that falls when the supernatural happens and no one needs to scream. There is a world that cannot be seen, and it is not made of clouds or wings like in children's cartoons. It is a world that surrounds us, that fights for us, that hears prayers before our mouths even open, that sends answers in ways that no one expects, that brings light where there was mud, that pulls out of death those who no longer had the strength to ask for help. The certainty that remains is this: heaven is not far away. It is close, closer than anyone imagines. Sometimes all you have to do is close your eyes, and the touch comes, not as a vision, not as a dream, but as a truth that enters and changes everything, a certainty that does not scream but remains, like that hand, the one that left no mark on the ground, but forever marked the spirit. There are things that the eyes do not see, but the soul never forgets. Have you ever felt like you were hit by something that no one saw, but that changed everything inside, yes or no? Tell us your story and strengthen the faith of those who are still waiting for the impossible. And if this story reached you, believe me, it was not by chance. Maybe you are going through something that seems to have no way out. Maybe your soul is tired, your chest tight, your faith almost gone. But listen carefully. The same hand that rescued me in that flood is still outstretched today. Maybe not with our visible light, but with an eternal purpose. If something inside you moved while listening to this story, comment below. I need that hand too. Let's pray together. Let's support each other with real faith, because miracles are not over. And yes, angels are still among us. A new story of faith is coming. Do you believe that there are angels among us? Then click on the next video and come experience this divine emotion. See you there.